2009, a family go on holiday to France, and they buy their 7-year-old boy a Spider-Man comic. It's not in English, but he studies every page, every panel. It consumes his whole holiday. He begs his parents and grandparents to read it to him each night. At home, he watches the Sam Raimi films on repeat. The next year, he goes on holiday again and gets a new comic book. It's Iron Man, like from the films. The comic is called Extremis. He'd watched all the cartoons and kept up with YouTube videos breaking down every backstory. He delved into forums and all of that, but he'd never actually read a story that had such serious tones before, that was aimed at an older audience. That same year, he goes on to read New X-Men, and his love for these characters grows even more. The next year, he's 9. It's 2011, and he finally reads Flashpoint. His hero love grows to a new extreme. The next year, he decides to start reading single issues, no more trades, and he gets the early issues of the brand new Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comic book series. But he's a kid and can't afford to keep up with every single issue. Then a local comic book store moves into town, and from there, he delves into the whole world of collecting. This was my story and how I entered comics and reading them. Of course, I already had a love for the IPs in the form, but from here I've extended to and reached tons of different areas in the world of comic books. But for the last few years, I felt distant, left behind by the big two. I haven't read a Marvel comic in years, and DC has become so demanding in how much work I as a reader would need to put in. Welcome to Comics and Tea, where I rant and rave about comic books over a cup of tea. Today we're talking about alternate universes, and more specifically, the ultimate and absolute universe, and then why it is that people like and dislike alternate universes and how they can be done right. How they can actually save comics and help new people enter this fandom and this whole world. Getting into comic books is really difficult for a lot of people, for a lot of reasons, in all honesty. I completely understand it. A lot of us who are fans of other franchises and other forms of media have this sort of mentality that we have to, we have to know everything about a field or a topic, and we need to read it all or watch it all in chronological order. Those are two factors that just cannot be brought in when you enter a world of comic books. A, it has been around for almost a century now, and there is just so much to catch up on and to understand. And then on top of that, there's just so many different stories and characters who all will intermingle and show up at different points. Luckily, however, and most people don't realize this, but comic books are actually written in a really new reader friendly way. Often when there's something that requires you to have read something before, they just tell you what happened. Or at the very least, they'll tell you where to find it out. But you don't need to ever really know it. Stories are written to be completely fine on their own and not require any form of, back reading. But I completely get it. It can be daunting, it can be scary, and then there's also the fact that, quite frankly, comic books aren't very good at telling people what are good jumping on points, where to actually start. Comic books tend to be quite bad at letting you know, hey, this issue is really good to be friendly for new readers. Outside of big comics that are titled issue 1, don't get me wrong, you can always jump on a Spider-Man issue 1 or, a Captain America issue 1, they're always going to be new reader friendly, but sometimes you get like an issue 1 that comes out that really isn't. It ties into some big event or some other ongoing series, and you really need to know the backstory before you can read it. This is where the appeal of multiverse and alternate universes comes in. You see, the idea of a story that requires no back reading and no prior knowledge is such an appealing thought and appetizing thought for new readers that comic books have been trying to exploit and use this for years. The idea of a story that is set in its own world and you can just pick it up and read it sells so much better than issue 1042 of ongoing series insert here. So that is one major beneficial use to the multiverse and alternate realities. The other sort of key thing here is it's a good way to make old readers still feel inclusive when you reboot your universe so that new readers can hop on the main stuff now. You see, comic books really want people to read the mainline stories because these are ongoing and they keep your readers there for a longer time. Writers want to write on them because A, they pay more, and B, you have a long-lasting stamp on this ongoing storyline and you can actually tell way better stories. because of how much depth and building every character has had. Realistically, you want your readers to be reading whatever's canon, whatever the main universe is. All of this means that you don't want them reading the alternate universe stuff. So how do you do that? Well, you reboot, you start over, you make it so your main stuff is completely new reader friendly, and then you say all the old stuff is an alternate reality. So you still use the multiverse, it still helps you, it still benefits you in some way or another. But the absolute universe and the ultimate universe are not like that, they're different. Why do they feel different? Well, that's because they are concurrent to the main universe, and they sort of run ongoing. They aren't some one-off, you need no prior back reading storylines. They rely on two different things. So both of them rely on the concept of you have to read their universe. You have to know what's going on, at least within their run. You start on an issue 1 and you continue through the stories, reading as it goes on. Now, Absolute is going to be difficult to predict just how in-depth it's going to get, just how wild and how big it will be. You have to remember, we're in the early days. Most of them haven't even surpassed issue 5. Batman and Superman are both one issue at time of recording away from completing their storylines, and Wonder Woman is one issue behind that. And then Flash and Martian Manhunter are still on their way. We have no idea how in-depth and how deep this universe is going to go. But one thing to really understand this universe as a whole is you don't need to know anything to get onto it. A brand new person can pick up an Absolute Batman or Absolute Superman or Absolute Wonder Woman comic book for the very first time today and know just as much about that universe as anyone else, really. Maybe a few references here and there, stuff like the Joker's cameo appearance in the early issues of Batman, maybe you won't get. The overarching plot of the Lazarus Corporation in Superman might slightly baffle you. And who certain side characters are in Wonder Woman might be a bit of a surprise, but they're not going to be important. The comic will go on its way to explain all of these things perfectly fine for you. And to be honest, you might have a better experience reading it because you can't predict certain concepts and characters showing up. Where the Ultimate Universe differs, however, and something that has actually brought me back to Marvel comic books after giving it a read, I've fallen in love with it so much, is how it plays with nostalgia and twists certain things. You see, the Ultimate Universe does have a little bit of prior knowledge. It expects you to know the bare basics, and that is it, for all these different characters. Now, don't get me wrong, you can go into reading Absolute Marvel without actually knowing anything. Ultimate Marvel, sorry. You don't have to have read a Marvel comic book to pick up Ultimate Spider-Man issue 1 and start from there. But it will benefit the storyline, unlike the Absolute Universe, where I think actually not knowing might benefit, because the whole universe relies on showing you these slight changes and differences with these characters. But also, I feel like a lot of the nostalgia and a lot of the fun that comes from these alternate worlds really rely on your memories and fondness of these characters and how much you loved them before all the big events and all the main universe storylines. How much you really just love the core aspects of those characters. So if the multiverse can be used in such brilliant ways and can be so helpful, why is it everyone hates it? There's a couple of reasons why people tend to dislike the multiverse in different adaptations of comic books and the like. And it really comes down to stuff to do with how they're depicted and how much they're used and what they do for the characters and stories as a whole. The first argument you often hear a lot of the time is, well, if it's not canon, if it's a different timeline, a different world, why would I care? And my response to that is, why do you normally care? Like, generally speaking, if you went to the cinema to watch a film, why would you care about that story? It's a one-off, it's only a couple hours long, and it doesn't go anywhere or lead anywhere, and there's no canon overarching universe. You care because the story makes you. You care for the characters involved as you watch and learn about them, and you grow a fondness of that film. The same thing can be said about alternate storyline universes. A one-off, one-shot that isn't canon can be really well received. In fact, it often is. Take stories like The Killing Joke or Hush. So popular that they were retroactively brought into canon. There's other stuff as well out there. Films, games, all sorts that people love. But then there's also cases where people really don't like them. A sort of contrasting use of this would be the comic book and TV show versions of Marvel's What If. The comic book What If series is really well received and generally for years has been a fan favourite storyline. But the TV show was regarded as being quite crap. The stories in it weren't handled the best, and the ones that people did tend to like really didn't feel like the rest of the show. Of course, it didn't help that What If had an overarching plot, completely butchered the concept of the Watcher, and doesn't really understand the idea of what makes what if by having them all cross over. But the episodes themselves shouldn't have been affected by that concept, right? Only the finale really should have been judged that heavily. Why didn't people feel like the rest? Well, I mean, don't get me wrong, I do think the finale left a sour taste in people's mouths, but I think it was also just a case that it was what if versions of the MCU, which already has a litany of adaptation errors. And so then adding more errors on top of that really compiled it into something that people just didn't like. And that's an issue that I think really derives from a lot of these multiverse stories. It's not about it being a one-off or about it being this. It's on its own. It's about how the characters involved are adapted. Especially in the comic book world, people pick up books not based on the writer or the artist or the name of the comic, but based on who shows up. Don't get me wrong, if you put Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo on a comic together, I'm probably going to pick it up because I'm a sucker for when they work together. That's true, and there's a lot of people out there who will read anything with Hickman's name across it, and I will have to, by the right of being a die-hard fanboy for the character, pick up anything that's titled Red Hood, like, ever. But that's not how the general public really do things. They pick up a comic book because a character they like is in it. And if you pick up a comic solely because a guy you like shows up in it, and they aren't how they're supposed to act, they act weird or strange or not how you'd predict, you'd feel a little robbed. You'd feel offended almost. It would be wrong. They're not predicting your character right, and that's why you spent the money on it. So to then apply this to other things like multiversal stories, if a character's handled wrong or just portrayed poorly, it comes off like, why would I care? That's not my character in that story. I wouldn't care about that. It's some random character who has no meaning to me in a story that's not relevant to anything else. The second reason is a lot of alternate universe stories that are one-shots tend to try and be too grandiose, too big. They forget that the benefit of this is you can tell just a normal story, just a story with that character that would naturally fit that character, without having to worry about its impacts on the greater world, or how things are used, or how people interpret them, or whether it's allowed to be canon. You're just telling a fun story. Some of the best Elseworld plotlines could easily appear in main canon and just be referenced, but they don't because they aren't. They're simply an Elseworld story giving a writer a chance to write whatever they felt like. You see, this is why often the MCU's version of Iron Man is regarded as positive and well portrayed, but the Snyder version of Batman and Superman are hated so much. Don't get me wrong, I know there's Snyder fans out there, you guys can enjoy whatever you want, that's fine. But you have to admit, Snyder did not write Batman and Superman. He wrote a story with his own characters and then put the IP of Batman and Superman on top of them. Whereas when the Iron Man film came out, at least, the MCU was still trying to write their characters as their comic book characters. Iron Man shares a lot of qualities with his comic book counterpart. Don't get me wrong, IDJ brought a lot of new stuff to the table, and changing things is fine. In fact, it's positive. Take advantage of your alternate realities. But you have to pay respect to where it came from. Pay respect to the story that was before you. In this case, the comic book your character's inspired by. I said there were a couple of reasons why comic book fans don't like the multiverse, and I've only listed one, this why would I care about the character in that story. But the second one I think is actually probably more prevalent and why I put it off till second. And that is the overabundance of major multiversal crisis storylines and characters no one gives a damn about for the sake of showing a cool design. So there's a couple things to break down there. First of all, we'll talk about characters and their designs and that being their only selling point, a big toy seller. In the 80s, this idea of selling franchises just to pivot and push more toys was a major thing, bigger than any time before. Characters like He-Man, Lion-O of the Thundercats, all four of the Ninja Turtles. These guys were all designed to just push toys. The biggest example actually would probably be like Transformers or something. At this point, it was all about giving Batman 1,000,001 suits, so you knew he could have a toy for each one, right? It was stuff like that. And as time has gone on, we've also developed a culture of just really enjoying as fans these cool designs and alternate things. Here on YouTube, there is a whole sector, a whole community of artists who make brilliant videos and projects and work where they just redesign characters, or give them cool prompts or alternate concepts that they play with. And that alone, I think, proves that people want to see this stuff, so it doesn't make it bad or inherently anything silly to put in a comic book. Use it, right? But the issue is when you're telling a story and then you rely that story on Captain Ven America or something like that no one has any relation to or care for, it kind of kills it. And I think this issue stemmed from Spider-Verse. You see, Spider-Verse was a brilliant comic book when it came out. For those of you who haven't read it, I highly recommend it. I would actually say it's better than the Spider-Verse films, which I really enjoy those movies. But the initial comic book was actually a really well-written piece. And it sort of delves into the idea of what does it mean to be Spider-Man. As we see all these different universe versions, it wasn't about selling, hey, look at this and that. In fact, most of them were pre-existing from comic books, and it was just showing that they were still around. And it delved into this idea of Spider-Men can all have different takes, but at the end of the day, they all share. Oh my god, I've had to record this segment now so many times. First, the camera stopped recording because the footage, it ran out of storage. Then this was playing up like a few times in a row. Then I got it all to work and I was doing it, only to find out I wasn't recording the footage. Brilliant. What a great first episode to this series. Sorry. So where was I? Spider-Verse. You see, Spider-Verse itself proved that comic books can do a story with a bunch of different versions of these characters, because it was all about the idea of there being all these different Spider-Men who were drastically different. They were unique characters, but they shared a common point, a concept that drove them together as one individual character. This is kind of like what the movies did, to a degree, although they focus more on the differences between these Spider-Men than what made them one. But it was interesting, it actually made these alternate universe Spider-Men a core facet of the world. That being said, it led to a litany of events that were mimics of it, copies, that really weren't interesting at all. Spider-Verse itself had 3 or 4 sequels. There was like 2 more Spider-Verses and a Spider-Geddon. It was really not good. And then from that, they went on to do like how many Venomverse type events, and then also Gwenverse. Nobody cared. Nobody really did, because these characters weren't important. The main universe characters of them were important, not because they're main universe or because they're canon, but because they had stories and ongoing plot points that you can follow and care about and something interesting. These alternate characters were basically panel filler. They showed up to look and stand there, and that's it. No one tends to care for that, and that's where that got frustrating. Whereas DC, or also in some cases Marvel as well, but mainly DC, they were annoying people with other types of events, crises. Now, the reason why I'm using DC as an example for crises is because they invented the phrase for DC fans, or for comic book fans, should I say. And that is like a multiversal global event where a problem's going to happen that will change the status quo. And recently we have had far too many of them, and they have felt lackluster and kind of like they're lying to you as a reader, promising status quo changes that never happen, screwing around characters who you've cared for years. The biggest culprit of this, I would argue, is Nightwing, who at the end of every major crisis event lately, Dark Knight's Metal, Death Metal, Dark Crisis, all of these, he was promised to be the leader of the Justice League going forwards, and then was immediately sent back to Bloodhaven and never to work with the Justice League again the second the event ends. It's ridiculous. And then a lot of these events also promised reboots that never came about. They promised major status quo changes that never came about. Pretty much any death that might have occurred didn't last. Wonder Woman ascended to creatorhood, godhood level type stuff, and just sort of thrown it away because the producers couldn't lose Wonder Woman from the comics, so they brought her back like the same issue. It's ridiculous that these comic book events aren't allowed to actually do what their one purpose is. And then if you don't care about the events, if you are fed up with them, they're even more frustrating to you, because your comic books that are coming out have to go on pause, they have to go on break, slow down, do whatever. If the writer has to move over to the event to write for the event, maybe your character has to get involved in the event, which means one of two things: either A, your comic book goes on pause so the character can appear in the event, or B, it continues while the event's happening, but now there are 2 versions of your character running around with completely different personalities, because they either can't spoil the arc that your character's going on in your comic, or the event does pay true to the actual plot, but what that means is your character's already been through the arc that's in your comic. There's a ton of things like this. It just gets frustrating as a reader. And then the event ends, and either A, your character gets canned because they're not a part of the new line of comic books that are coming out. B, your character continues, but now they have to be new reader friendly again, which means they won't reference half the stuff you just read, and the stuff they do reference are going to sit there and over-explain what happened constantly so new readers can hop on. Or C, it's a reboot, and your character has to start over from the very beginning thanks to the status quo change. It's ridiculous, and it's really annoying. So comic book fans have been hating on this for ages, and we already went over why movie and TV show fans bloody hate the multiverse. So is it doable? Like, can we save the multiverse and superhero content? Yeah, of course it's fixable. Of course it's savable. I already mentioned at the moment that concurrent multiverses really help. They do the job that a multiverse can, which is they can tell stories not affected by the main universe. That then brings a bunch of different options in. It means writers can have fun, express themselves, be creative. Comic book fans can relive the joy of learning about their favorite characters, seeing them sort of created in a unique way and have fun with it. New readers can hop on without having to worry about history or lore or any of that. And generally speaking, it just works a charm. But is that the only way to handle it? Well, what about how the major events affect everything? Honestly, I do believe that Marvel and DC, specifically referring to the big two, need to cool it on this multiversal stuff. They need to stop using it as a gimmick or something to plaster a name onto things. They need to stop saying, hey look, it's the multiverse. And they need to just use it as the tool it is. We don't brand main universe content as prime universe. This is part of the canon. I really hope you can't hear the annoying ass scrap man outside. It's so loud. But yeah, we need to stop using it as a gimmick. It's not a toy branding to slap on the front. And that I think is a big fix that could really help. The other thing is to just call it on the major events. Either stick to a major status quo change or don't do the events at all. I know there always are going to be these big crossover events, but that doesn't mean they have to be Crisis level. Not everything has to be Secret Wars or Infinite Crisis. That's just not how it is. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention arguably the most successful multiversal plotline used in recent history. Marvel Rivals, something we talk about a lot on the channel here. It has done a brilliant job at incorporating tons of different universe versions of the characters. I think a lot of people who don't know comic books and also don't read the lore pages of these characters don't realize this, but most of the roster are straight up alternate universe versions of the characters. Not just picking different ones from the comics, which it does do, but also just from each other. Even if they look somewhat similar, when you read their lore, they are drastically different versions of the character. Hell, the lore sheet for Punisher's for 2099 Punisher, not for main Punisher. And if you look at how he looks in the game, he certainly doesn't look like main Punisher. I know we have a 2099 skin for him, but that's a completely different one you're playing as anyway. Other examples being, obviously, we have Peach Momoko's Demon Days X-Men version of Psylocke. And then Jeff is also from an alternate universe, and Mantis is also non-mainline universe Mantis. Tons of characters with alternate versions. Penny in of herself is inherently an alternate reality version of a character because she only exists in like one reality, which is not the canon. The other thing to remember when talking about the multiverse is, in comic books, continuity is bullshit. It's a lie. I know a bunch of you are thinking, but continuity is everything. We map out. None of it makes sense. If you actually plot any of the big two characters' timelines, it makes no sense. The aging, the events, when stuff can and can't take place, really doesn't work because of comic books' inherent intermeshing and web-like structure. It just doesn't fit. So don't get bogged down too much in continuity. I already said before, there are non-canon comic books that are super popular. Hell, I remember when Free Jokers came out and that thing was massive. That's not canon. I bet a bunch of you didn't even realize that. Like, there's tons of different comic books that can be good stories on their own without worrying about continuity or everything around it, as long as they get the characters involved correct. They have to interpret them the right way. I genuinely do believe that the Ultimate Universe and the Absolute Universe have potential, and that they could be a great future for comic books. But saying that they could like save comics is a bit extreme. The comics themselves have to do that. That's something that you can't just fix with two storylines. You can't say Ultimate Spider-Man is going to bring everyone back to Marvel. Sure, it got me picking up some Marvel comics again, but I've only really been reading the Ultimate Universe at the moment. Nothing about the main universe has really enticed me back into it. I think it's just the freedom they've given them on this alternate run. And as for stuff like Absolute, yeah, I still regularly read normal DC comic books. Like, I never stopped. But the Absolute Universe I'm enjoying for the stories that I'm reading. If I pick up Absolute Flash or Martian Manhunter issue 1 and they're crap, I'm not going to continue reading those individual stories. The Absolute Universe in of itself can't save anything, and neither can any one comic book. It's a mentality that these industries have to take. They have to actually fix the issues. And I would say the current signs looking forward, when we step outside of the comic book realm, Marvel are delving ever further into the gimmick nature of the multiverse. They're pushing these actual interesting stories and plotlines away in favor of gimmicked characters and what ifs, and silly takes on how characters could have looked, and what if this and this meshed, without actually writing a decent story around it, and I think that's worrying. Whereas, I can at least say, at the moment, as bad as many of their projects have been lately, DC aren't going in that direction. They are trying to step away from the gimmick of the multiverse. At the moment, it doesn't look like there's any major multiverse events in plan in film, game, or comic book or TV show, which is really nice to see. I guess that raises one question. I said before the key element to get all this right is to actually understand the character you're writing, to write them properly, to make them them. So what makes a character a character? What are the core elements of them? More specifically, if we take a look at the success case, Absolute Batman. What makes Batman Batman? Why is it some adaptations are bad, some are good? Well, I'm all out of tea, so I guess that'll have to wait till next episode. But I just want to thank you all for sticking around, for watching this new series. I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to get a chance to talk to the camera about the thing I love and just have a rant. These aren't scripted, so if I go on a ramble or a tangent, I apologize. And I also want to apologize if there was any scratching noise in the background. That's mainly because of these fuckers. These little shits. There's 3 of them, and they love to make noise whenever I'm in here talking. They are very apologetic. And I just really wanted to have fun, have a drink, and just talk to you guys. These videos will hopefully, I don't know yet, it'll say on the text on the screen in a second, but will hopefully be a little easier for me to edit, which means I can get these in between other videos done a lot of the time. I also just want to talk about comic books. Maybe sometimes I'll be doing what I did here, where I do a rant about a topic. Maybe sometimes I'll sit here and just tell you about a story, a bit of history for comics. I can kind of consider this a bit like a comic book club almost, where we just talk about topics and ideas. I want to hear from you guys in the comments. I want to hear all of that. If you love Marvel Rivals, check out our other videos. We have some character pitches on the channel. If you like DC comics and you want to see that for Marvel Rivals, we have a new series that started up. We've got episode 1 out already of making DC characters into Marvel Rivals, and then there'll be more of these coming soon, so stick around for those as well. Thank everyone. Make sure to support your local brick and mortar stores. I always link my one in the cards, so feel free to buy from them. They do deliver online and internationally, so check them out. Thanks everyone. See ya.